near and dear to our heart, given our mandate and our focus. But it's always a surprise to me how many other stakeholders are interested in this topic. It's a difficult topic and a complex one, but it's increasingly important as we move to a low carbon society. So we're pleased to have so many people from various sectors joining us today. So my name is Brian Marcel. I'm the Vice President of Policy and Programs at the Atmospheric Fund. And
yeah, I'm the Carbon and Co-Benefits Quantification Manager here on TAF.
And the Atmospheric, a few notes before we get started, actually. So you won't be able to speak during the webinar, but you are able to ask questions at any time by using the question dialog box in the bottom right of the software screen. So you can type in your question at any time, and we wait until a bit later. We have a few points where we're going to be taking questions or answering questions, but you can type it in at any time on the right of your software screen. And after the webinar, you'll be emailed the webinar recording as well as the PDF of the new report that summarizes the research. All right, so let's get started. And first, we thought it would be helpful to start with a quick poll. Just we're curious to find out how many participants are already familiar with our emissions factor work from our 2017 report, and just to get a sense of where people are at. So the poll should appear on your screen, and you can just click an option.
Yeah.
All right, so about half and half familiar with the work and not familiar. Don't worry if you haven't been familiar with the earlier version of this research. We're going to be covering it from scratch, but it's helpful for us to get that context. So very briefly, I'm going to give a bit of information about TAF for those who don't know who we are. TAF is a regional climate agency that invests in low carbon solutions across the greater Toronto and Hamilton area. We were founded about 30 years ago by the City of Toronto, and in 2017 expanded our mandate to the greater Toronto Hamilton area. We invest in low carbon solutions through grants, investments, and our own program work. And our mandate is really about achieving deep decarbonization across the sector. So now I'll give just a brief overview of the presentation content that we're going to be going over. So as a bit of background, as I think we're all aware of the growing urgency around climate change and dealing with climate change. And this was highlighted last week with the Government of Canada declaring a climate emergency. So it's really important to take action, to take accelerated action, but at the same time, it's more important than ever to accurately understand the carbon impacts of our actions or programs and policies that we're designing or considering, because we don't have time to get on false tracks or to invest in solutions that don't advance carbon reduction. And at the same time, poor quantification can mask the true impact of promising carbon reduction strategies. So given the urgency around the issue, it's just increasingly important to have highly accurate, precise emissions calculations that can help us to understand, to identify and prioritize and monitor the impact of climate change mitigation strategies. And particularly today, we're focusing in on electricity than for other fuel sources. And traditional methods, the industry standard is to use an average emissions factor, usually sourced from Canada's National Inventory Report. But this can mask and oversimplify the impact of electricity emissions. And so a little bit more background on why that is. In Ontario today, we're lucky to be in a situation where more than 90% of the electricity being produced is produced basically carbon-free from hydro, nuclear, and renewables. And the remainder, less than 10%, comes from natural gas power plants, especially during peak hours. But while natural gas supplies only a small share of the electricity supply in Ontario, it's disproportionately likely to be the generating resource that responds to changes in demand. Because of its relatively higher costs and its ability to rapidly ramp up or ramp down electricity production, natural gas power plants are frequently used to respond to changes in variability in demand, whether that's increases or decreases. On the other hand, many of our other generating sources, like nuclear power plants, are rarely on the margin in that case, because nuclear power plants have very, very limited ability to adjust output without shutting down completely for days at a time. So it's not as simple as using the average factor, because that's really masking a couple of key factors, right? There's what's going on at different times of day on the electricity system is highly variable. And then there's actually what resources is ready to respond to changes in demand, which is another more complicated issue. So that comes down to of marginality, really, and which is a concept common in economics, but not so much in other sectors. And so it's a little bit like imagining, you know, in baseball, you have, you understand who the batters are on a team, but warming up on the batter's deck, getting ready to be the next batter. So you have to kind of understand where the electricity system is at different times to understand what the impact of increasing or reducing demand is going to be on emissions at any given point in time or in any season. So that's why it becomes a little bit more complicated. And what we found is that there's no one emissions factor that is suitable for all purposes when it comes to understanding the emissions impacts of electricity related issues. And so we need a range of emissions factors if we want really accurate quantification that are suitable for different purposes. And really that's what we're going to be going over today and what the report goes over. So it provides a range of emissions factors that we've developed and provided for others to use. We're going to be going over the methodology and data sources used to do that, and covering guidelines for how to know which emissions factors are suitable for different quantification purposes. So it's a little bit complex, but we're trying to try and make it simple for you to understand which factor we recommend for different estimation purposes.
Okay, before going to the emission factors that Brian is talking about, we are going to review the data sources and the methodology we have applied to calculate those factors. During the investigation, we reached out to ISO, asking them about the best way to estimate the marginal resource in the electricity market. And according to them, the data potential agreements with electricity generators, making this information not available. We think that the best available source of information is output and capability report, which present the energy output and capability for generating facilities in the ISO administered energy market with a maximum output capability of 20 megawatts or more. So using this data and accounting only for the generators of 20 megawatts or more carries certain limitations. First, there are more than 3,000 contracts with an output of capability of less than 20 megawatts, but they account for not a lot of output. And out of those, only 100 of those are running, no, less than 100. Actually, 20 on natural gas. So those small contractors are not supposed to increase the natural gas on the margin. This data doesn't account also for behind the meter generation, and this presentation is not intended to provide information or factors for this type of electricity generation. 0.77% in 2018 did increase from last year when it was 4.4%. After a few years of decline, it was around 9 in 2014, 10%, 9 again in 20% of the electricity mix provided by gas. And even if now it's 7%, we are going to talk later about how this is supposed to increase over the next 10, 15 years. Evidently, if we look at the other graph, electricity generation on average day follows a similar pattern as demand, with a small peak around 9 a.m. Nuclear is pretty stable along the day, and the two main sources that change generation over the day to meet demand are hydro and natural gas, making them the most prominent resource. Well, we also have biofuel, which is not very important, but we focus on natural gas as a carbon emission source in electricity generation in Ontario. We are going to focus on when natural gas is used in the system and what is specifically about this. The electricity generated with natural gas is an expensive resource and is used mainly to provide flexibility to the system and increase supply in periods of high demand, when the rest of the generators just can't meet it. But there are a few variables that also influence natural gas generation. Part of these generators are combined cycle plants, which require long periods and then need to run for last 4 hours. And this time it's already excluded for short-term change in demand, which will be outside of what we are considering the margin. Natural gas generators also run at night to carry capacity and other kind of tests. And also there are generators running under contract market implementation, which generates electricity regardless of demand. This natural gas generation generates some noise in the data when we try to identify exactly what part of this natural gas is the marginal resource. But we can see in this next graph how natural gas respond to on a way more drastic than the average total change. For example, we can see that the change between 2015 and 2016, total demand reduced by only 2%, but the natural gas generation reduced by almost 17%. A 5% reduction in total demand carries a 50% reduction in natural gas generation. And this trend changed again in 2018, when only a 2.3 increase in total electricity generation changed to almost 60% of natural gas generation. Focus on this data, we have changed our methodology. Again, the publicly available information is not enough to determine the marginal emission factor, so we have to make several assumptions to process the data. In our last publication, we applied the following constraints to obtain our marginal emission values. It had to be a minimum 1% change in generation compared to the previous hour, and to be considered a marginal change were put in question as part of the feedback received from our last report, and after performing a sensitivity analysis, we have decided to remove them since their impact in the result is negligible. The other main change we have made to our methodology is that we have changed how we average the percentage of natural gas of the margin. In the previous methodology, we used the specific hour of the day, but now we are using total generation to calculate the marginal values. I'm going to explain what that means in the next slides. Like I said, after undertaking additional research, TAFs consider that the best indicator to determine the amount of natural gas as a marginal resource is total electricity demand. As we can see, as total demand increases, the proportion of natural gas on the margin also increases. It's also possible to appreciate that the amount of natural gas on the margin presents highly oscillating values at very low, under 30,000 megabytes, or very high, over 20,000 megabytes of demand. This can be explained given that the sample size for these extreme values is not large enough to cancel the effect of variability of the system. like wind and hydro generation and system constraints. When demand is very low and a very high when demand is very high. Probably close to 80% and the 20% could be covered by imports, for example. As a result of the lack of not good quality data, this methodology is probably overestimating natural gas on the margin at low demand rates. Marginal emission factor is calculated for each hour, given that very high or very low demand value. Besides total demand, the other main factors that affect natural gas generation on the mix are extreme temperatures, which increase generals and peak demands and the availability of other resources. Solar and hydro being the ones that are more significant. The increase of natural gas as a marginal resource displays a different correlation with the increase in generation for each season of the year. As we can see in this graphic, the line that displays the summer increase in natural gas correlated to total demand is 40% around 15,000 and 18,000 total generation, and we can see that the rest of it is closer to 20%. That can be made here, yeah. This proportion can be explained given the shortage of hydro generation and expected high demand. And since some of the natural gas generation needs to ramp up earlier to meet the demand that we are going to take over the last day, and when demand is going to go up over 20,000 generation, in the summer we need to increase natural gas generation earlier, as the way that we average our gas on the margin. About the results, we can compare here total generation and marginal generation. We can see that nuclear accounts for 60% of total generation, but when we look at marginal, it's always less than 10%. Nuclear is always very stable and doesn't respond to demand. But if we look to gas, it's always around 9, 8. Now we are almost at 7%, but it accounts for almost 30% of marginal generation. And that's what we think the emission factors are very important about them. Before going to our emission factors, I want to review our results. ISO generates information related to the type of generator that sets the market clearing price, although it's not released to the public. The market surveillance panel of the Ontario Energy Board used this information, and in conversations with them, they confirmed us that this is a variable is a good proxy for the generator on the margin. They have several reports with data regarding the proportion of each generator that sets the market clearing price. This is the most expensive generator and is the one that is supposed to be on the margin. The most recent reports we found cover information from the period from November 2014 to October, meaning the accuracy of our current methodology. We have calculated all the resources on the margin, not natural gas, to be able to compare our methodology with this data. And it's possible to appreciate that trends and values as the market clearing price doesn't capture the high variability in wind and hydro. For example, we can see in January 2015 that our methodology reflects a higher value of wind on the margin than what actually was happening in the market clearing price. You can see the same in September 2015. So we can see in the graphs that the sample size is not very high, but variability on wind and hydro generation is not properly captured in our methodology. If we go to this chart, this shows the comparisons between our percentage gas of the margin and the CMP again for each month for November 2014 to October 2016. We also can see the specific temperature for each month and the historical average temperature. The largest difference between our price take place in January and February 2015, when there is a temperature way below what is the average for those months, and also in August 2018, where the temperature is higher. We also can see difference in September and October 2015, which can be explained by extreme temperatures, but wind generation was very low in both months, although it's unclear if this difference is also magnified for other factors. This comparison shows that our methodology captures the trend in natural gas marginal generation, but lack of good enough data means it underestimated for exceptionally high demand levels and extreme temperatures. And we look forward to refine the methodology over time. One last thing before going to the emission factors, we are going to talk about the limitations of our methodology. All the emissions factors presented here exclude the impacts of emissions associated with the construction, maintenance, and eventual decommissioning of power plants or renewable energy facilities, the location of the consumption of generation of electricity, and thus the effect of the transmission bottlenecks, upstream emissions from natural gas production and transmission, as well as uranium mining and processing, and emissions generated from imported electricity. 97% of Ontario's 2017 imports came from Quebec and Manitoba, with very low or zero emissions associated, so we think that electricity imports are unlikely to increase the emission factors. Finally, major changes in province-wide electricity consumption or productions with themselves affect the marginal emission factor once implemented. This methodology applied to obtain the factors presented in this presentation allows the accurate use of our marginal emission factors values up to 100 megawatts of change in demand of generation. Beyond that, the marginal emission factor values will gradually start to change, and therefore we should be cautious applying this to large scale of transformative interventions, and a customized modeling approach will be preferable. Maybe we can take if there are questions about the methodology. Yeah, we don't need none. Yeah. We're good. So we are going finally to the results. So quantifying carbon emissions typically fulfills one of two purposes: to understand current or historical emissions, such with a GHG inventory for an organization of a city, which an average emission factor should be used, or to evaluate the carbon impact of an actual or potential change, for example, a project, policy, or infrastructure decisions, when we recommend the use of a marginal emission factor. In either case, when forecasting, we have also made some forecast emission factors that should be used given the changes that we are going to observe within the next few years in Ontario's electricity mix. So those are the series of emission factors that we have developed in our new report. We have annual and hourly average emission factors, annual, hourly, peak and off-peak, and seasonal marginal emission factors. And we have forecast annual average emission factors, annual marginal emission factors, and peak and off-peak marginal emission factors. Now we are going to describe them one by one. And finally, we are going to try to give some tools to help deciding which emission factors should be used in either situation. We are going to start with the annual average emission factor, which is the measure of the average amount of carbon pollution produced per kilowatt hours of electricity consumed in Ontario. It's the value reported annually in Canada's national inventory reports, But since the 2019 data only includes information up to 2017, we have calculated the factor for 2018, which is these 31 grams of CO2 equivalents per kilowatt hour. Those annual average emission factors, like I said, are intended for calculating emissions from current or historical electricity consumption, such for an inventory. We have also here an example of how to use these emission factors. We always just do the multiplication between electricity consumption and the respective emission factor. If we use two different factors for load switching, we just do twice the multiplication and subtract the difference. The document we are going to send you after this presentation contains several examples which you can review. Going on, next is the hourly average emission factor, which is similar to the annual, but reflects the average carbon intensity of electricity consumed in Ontario in any given hour. It can be used for calculating emissions from current or historical electricity consumption when a greater degree of precision is needed and where hourly data is available or can be estimated. This graph compares average and marginal hourly emission factors. We can see here more clearly why it's pretty important to use both distinctly, since the marginal emission factors are more than 3 times higher than the average. Now, going to the annual marginal emission factor. This is the estimate of change in carbon emissions resulting from an actual or proposed change in electricity consumption in Ontario. I want to emphasize again that there is a very different purpose between average emission factors and marginal emission factors, and that we cannot use both of them in the same quantifications. An annual marginal emission factor will be sufficient for many purposes when we are analyzing those changes in generation or demand. And if we can, we also can apply the next emission factors we are going to explain, like the hourly, seasonal, peak and off-peak. But in case of doubt, annual marginal emission factor is recommended. The only problem is that it's not possible to quantify the impact of energy storage or loss system initiatives without the use of either hourly or peak and off-peak factors. As you can see, the value for 2018 is 134. And I want to insist once again, because I know this question is coming, we cannot use the marginal emission factor if we are doing our inventories with average emission factors.
Can I just interject for a minute? Why don't you go back to the previous slide? I just want to, take a step back to outline the concept of a marginal emissions factor, just in case some of the audience might be struggling to understand it. So, really, in layman's terms or layperson's terms, it reflects the fact that when we make a change to either, reduce demand by a kilowatt or increase demand by a kilowatt. It's not the case that every single power plant in Ontario is going to adjust their production by a tiny few couple of watts to adjust to that change in demand. In reality, the way the grid is operated, when we reduce or increase demand by a kilowatt, one specific facility will respond to that change in demand. So using a marginal emission factor attempts to capture that complexity and say, how can we reflect that when we estimate the impacts? Because if we conserve a kilowatt, it's not the case that a nuclear plant is turning down its production by that kilowatt likely, or so there's some one specific power plant at any given time that's responding to changes in demand, and we can be more accurate in understanding the impacts of electricity changes if we try and factor that in. So that's what we mean about a marginal emissions factor. It's really trying to factor in what specific generating resource is prepared at that moment in time to respond to that change in demand. Annual one just reflects how that plays out over an entire year for simplicity, and then we'll get to the more detailed versions, which are more specific.
Yeah. So using the definition Brian just used for what is a marginal generators and a marginal emission factor. We are going to go now for the early marginal emission factor. It's very similar to the annual, but as the early average emission factor, it reflects the change in carbon emissions in any given hour of the day. This enables additional precision and customization of our quantifications. These early emission factors can be applied to interventions where specific early changes in electricity generation or consumption are known or can be estimated. For example, switching electricity appliance usage to night hours or solar photovoltaic generation, battery storage. It's worth mentioning that the difference in early marginal emission factors throughout the day are not significant on the weekend when total demand is lower. So if we are, this graphic shows more what will be happening in the working hours. We have also developed peak and off-peak marginal emission factors, are also a measure of the carbon impact of changes in electricity consumption during peak and off-peak times. They are simpler to apply than the marginal emission factors, but still provide greater precision than the annual. Peak hours are defined as weekdays 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., following ISO definition. For some times of the year, we can see high early marginal emission factors between 8 and 9 p.m., and that might increase the off-peak marginal emission factor a little bit, therefore reducing the real impact of switching consumption from peak to peak, but we think those factors are useful to reflect these switches. As with the early marginal emission factors, peak and off-peak can be used for time shifting consumption and energy savings during peak hours. These are recommended when there is not enough information about the exact time of the day when the shift on electricity consumption is taking place, or only we need an approximate calculation. We have also developed seasonal marginal emission factors. It makes sense because the marginal emission factor is lowest in spring, with relatively low demand due to mild temperatures and more high availability of hydro generation. Fall has a low demand, but not the same availability of hydro, and that's why we can see that the emission factor is a bit higher. Winter is even higher due to higher consumption from electricity heating system, but yeah. And finally, summer is the highest of the 4 seasons. That was the case for 2018, and we can appreciate the highest difference between winter and summer, although it's highly dependent on the extreme temperatures. So a very cold winter can have an emission factor closer to the summer that it has to the spring, which was the case in 2018. We can see here the daily profiles of the different seasonal emission factors. Spring, winter, and fall follow a similar pattern, and we can see the highest one, summer, also is high during the mid hours of the day because of the energy needed for cooling systems. Finally, we have forecast emission factors, because in many cases it's desirable to understand the impact of changes in electricity consumption well into the future. And it's common practice to use the most recent year's emission factors and simply carry it forward, but we can forecast it with future emission factors based on published ISO's data, and is likely going to reflect more accurately the impact of our projects in the future. We have forecast more efficient factors to 2035, and in order to do so, we have used natural gas generation values presented in the last ISO Technical Planning Committee. Like I mentioned a few times before in this presentation, emissions are forecast to gradually increase from 3.3 megatons of CO2 in 2018 to 10.9 in 2035. And that's why we can see an increase in the average and marginal emission factors over this period of time. This forecast might change over time with any new policy decisions or technological developments, and there is considerable uncertainty around the forecasted factors, becoming more significant as the forecasts go further into time. Change might result in material variation to the forecast, but the information we're using for this report is the most accurate available at the moment. After talking about the emission factors, we are going to present now decision aids to help you on which emission factor shall we use. I don't know if you want to.
Sure. So we kind of put together this decision tree, as I think about it, that helps you guide you towards the appropriate factor for different purposes. So the first question is whether you're trying to do a greenhouse gas inventory for a company or a city or a province for that matter, or whether you want to understand the impact or potential impact of a change or intervention that whether that's a policy, a program, or a project. So that's the key you need to ask. Are we just trying to understand the inventory of a current emissions source, or are we trying to understand the impact of a change that we have made or are thinking about making? So if then for each of those, there's a little bit more factors to consider. So if you're doing an inventory, then if it's just a simple analysis or there's limited data available, then an annual average emissions factor is simple to use and just makes sense. Whereas if you're doing an inventory and you want to do a precise analysis for various reasons, and you have hourly data, or you can estimate the hourly load profiles, then an hourly average emissions factor makes a lot of sense, and we've provided that. Then with respect to changes and interventions, if you're doing a simple analysis or you have limited data, then just using an annual marginal emissions factor is very easy to apply. We've provided that, and it's generally sufficient for a lot of purposes. However, if you want to do a more precise analysis and there's potential seasonal impacts, like with heating or cooling related electricity use, then you can use seasonal marginal emissions factors, which we provided. And if you want to do a more precise analysis and you have time of use data or you can estimate time of use data, then we've provided either hourly marginal emissions factors or the peak and off-peak factors, which are a little bit simpler to apply. So this kind of gives you a sense of the whole range of factors you can choose and how to select the one that's appropriate for your purposes. So then we have a few examples which we can go through that kind of illustrate how this works. So for example, if you're doing electricity efficiency measures or you're looking at the impact of that, let's say it's a lighting retrofit, then if the lights are, if it's only overnight lighting, like let's say outdoor lighting, then you could use an off-peak marginal emissions factor, and that would be your preferable emissions factor to use. However, if the lighting is on 24/7, or if there's not certainty about when the lighting is used, then you could use an annual marginal emissions factor. In both cases, it's a marginal factor because you're looking at making a change and understanding the impact of that change. Electricity storage. So that's something there's growing interest in, and so, for example, that could be battery storage that is being charged off peak and then used to supply electricity to the grid during peak hours. So if the specific hours where you're going to charge and discharge the battery are known, then you could use an hourly marginal emissions factor. However, if you don't have that data, you don't know exactly when it's going to be charged and discharged, then you could perhaps just use a peak and off-peak marginal emissions factors if you're comfortable that the battery is going to be charged off-peak and provide energy back to the grid during peak hours. Load shifting. So for example, shifting use of appliances such as laundry machines and dishwashers to off-peak times. Once again, if you know the specific hours that you're shifting from and to, then you could use hourly marginal emissions factors to understand impacts. But once again, more likely you'll just know you're trying to shift from peak to off-peak times, and so you could use peak and off-peak marginal emissions factors. Renewable electricity generation. So for example, installing solar PV panels. if you actually often for large projects, you will have forecasts for hourly production data that you have available. And so you could use an hourly marginal emissions factor to understand the carbon impacts of providing that renewable electricity. However, if you're doing a simpler analysis and you don't have or want to work with hourly data, you could use a peak marginal emissions factor because solar production hours coincide with peak hours. So it'd be reasonable approximation to use a peak marginal emission factor. And then another example is an increase in electricity consuming activities. For example, increased deployment of electric vehicles. Of course, that's going to avoid gasoline use, which there are established factors for understanding the impact of that, but it will increase electricity use, of course. And so preferably if you know that the charging is going to be happening overnight, then you could use an off-peak marginal emissions factor to understand the emissions impact of that vehicle charging. But if you don't have confidence that it's going to be charged off-peak, and you think it's just unknown or random when the vehicle will be charged, then you could use an annual marginal emissions factor to estimate the impact of charging that electric vehicle. So that gives you a flavor of some typical uses for the emissions factors, and in each case we've got sort of the preferable factor if you want a more detailed analysis and you have data, and sort of a second easier option if you don't have the data or you're doing a quicker analysis.
Okay, so yeah, we're about to finish, and now we are going to address some of the questions we have received along the webinar. One of them was if we have factored the increasing amount of renewable natural gas into the natural gas supply, lowering the marginal emission factor for natural gas. No, we haven't. We will look into it and see the proportion of renewable natural gas is a significant fraction of total natural gas supply, and we can include this factor in our methodology if we consider that is significant. Thanks for the input.
Here's another one for you, Juan.
Yeah, what is the emission factor used for gas plants? We are using a factor around 360 grams per kilowatt hour of electricity generated.
Okay, and another question here was, did we calculate emissions factors for other sources such as natural gas used directly in buildings or use of the N-Wave deep lake water cooling system as examples? I will say that we do have an emissions factor for natural gas used directly in buildings. It's not covered in this report, but if you look on our website, we have a general methodology for carbon emissions quantification that covers other fuels like natural gas when it's used directly in buildings and homes, gasoline, diesel. We also look at water, for example. So we have those factors available, and if you can't find them, you can contact us. We don't ourselves have a factor for use of the deep lake water cooling system. I believe that N-Wave can advise customers or consultants around that. And we've had some discussion with them on how they could apply some of our factors to do so, but we don't have that information, a factor for that at this time.
Okay, I have another one here. What is the expected uncertainty of the forecast average emission factor?
I think it's very difficult to put a range on the uncertainty. So we keep tabs on the forecasts which come out of the IESO regularly, and they move around quite a lot based on changes in how they're forecasting future demand and production. A lot of it relates as well to government policy decisions around conservation programs. We've seen some significant changes there just recently, as well as plans for new generation. So it's subject to quite a bit of variation, largely due to policy decisions. I think it'd be impossible for us to really put a confidence range on it because of that. But we feel that it's more accurate to use a forecast than to just assume the current factor extends into the future.
I have another question related to the emission factor used for the gas plants. I don't have the value at the top of my head, but I will send it to you, including the email regarding the efficiency of the GAR power plants use. I can include how we have calculated the emission factor for natural gas plants and what are the sources of our calculations. If we are still using the Delhaus approach, the Delhaus approach is the one used in the last methodology, and we removed, like I said before in the middle of the presentation, some of the constraints we applied, and we stopped comparing natural gas on the margin versus the time of the day, and now we are using total generation to average. So no, we are not using the house anymore, and those are the three main changes we have done in our methodology.
I have a question here about can we speak to generally the reason for natural gas generation increasing into the future? And yeah, I'll try to do so. And Juan, you can expand on this. And as I said, we've drawn that from IESO forecast, so we didn't develop that forecast. But generally, in the short to medium term, a big part of the reason is that several nuclear plants are being shut down temporarily for refurbishment, and then eventually Pickering is supposed to be shut down permanently. And so the current forecast or plan in Ontario is to make up for that reduction in nuclear generation, some of it temporary, some of it permanent, through increased use of natural gas generation. So that is basically the reason for the increased use of natural gas into the future.
Yeah, I agree.
So another question was about, did we take account of the impact of future shutdowns of the nuclear fleet? I think I covered that. Yes, we have.
Yeah, you can switch that. We are aware of any greenhouse gas accounting methodologies for the purposes of paying carbon liabilities that allows for time of day or seasonal carbon intensity factors. No, I've never seen allowance or credit systems that use any type of marginal emission factors. They always use average. Did you say 50 grams CO2 kilowatts for natural gas? No, we said between 350 and 400. I can include the specific number when we report the presentation, and it might be already included in our report. Okay, so seems like everything. Thank you very much for your attention. Wait, a last minute question. Fuel switching is often thought as a go-to measure for reducing emissions. However, based on your analysis procedure, the extra electrical consumption should be considered as at the margin. Can you just confirm that my understanding is correct?
I can take that one. Yeah, that's a great point. There's a lot of discussion about fuel switching as a key climate measure. Many forecasts include that as part of the solution to decarbonizing. That is mainly potentially moving away from natural gas combustion in buildings and homes for heating and towards electricity, or in the transportation sector as well, moving away from gasoline towards electricity for electric vehicles. And yes, the questioner is correct. If you're trying to understand the net impacts of fuel switching, whether it's in transportation or buildings, you should be using a marginal emissions factor to look at the impact of the additional electricity use, and then the appropriate emission factor to look at the avoided emissions from natural gas or gasoline or diesel. That still generally can result in a positive carbon reduction, but it's not, if you use an average factor, you're going to be exaggerating the net impacts. So it's an important consideration to take into account.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for your attention. I'm Juan Sotés.
And I'm Brian Marcel.
Please contact us with feedback or further inquiries. We are looking forward to hearing how you are using these factors and what your thoughts are on our methodology. This webinar presentation recording and our new guide will be mailed to you within a couple of hours. Thank you very much.